So that leaves one last presentation, which is actually myself. I'm not going to introduce myself. I'm just going to get on with the presentation as best I can. So I've relabeled my presentation it is there, because to POE or not to POE, that is the question. POE is such a dry subject. And Boston said, yeah, but we need to know about it. And I was like, okay, well, I'll do my best. The main reason I'm doing it is to promote my book. But first of all, a question. Hands up if you've heard of the phrase POE or post-occupancy evaluation. You should have, because it was mentioned already earlier today by at least one of our speakers. How many of you are actually doing post-occupancy evaluation? Yeah, you see? And that's the problem. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes is convince you all that we need to do more post-occupancy evaluation. Now, we're saying that we're not doing POE, but when you think about it, wherever you go, most places you go, you're asked for your opinion, you're asked for feedback, you're asked for feedback on a cup of coffee in Starbucks. It used to be done by little paper slips like this. Nowadays they do it through, they get you to sign onto the web, they take all your details and then they send you a feedback form. But this is how it was traditionally done. My favorite is still the Lego bricks, as you in the toilet. So I'm evaluating the experience of my toilet doings by pressing a little brick as I go out of the toilet. So everywhere's collecting feedback. And yet, something that Sir John Egan said back in 1998 was, how come all these other industries, the car industries, technology industries, they're all collecting occupant feedback, they're all collecting user feedback, and then they use that feedback to develop their goods and their services and their products. But we're not doing it in the architectural industry. And this is what got me into POE. My first POE was in 1998. That's when I started. Now, sadly, there's a really good reason why we need to do POE in buildings, and that's because of this. Whether you look at my data, this is amalgamated data from about 100 buildings, or even if you look at the Leaseman data, which has got over 1 million responses. They've conducted surveys all around the world, over 1 million responses. What I found, as you can see here, is about 40% of my respondents believe that their workplace doesn't support performance. Leaseman say it's something like 55%. So this is quite bad for our industry. How can we be developing buildings, offices, the purpose of which is to support the occupants and the organisation, and yet we're not delivering? And even worse, in most cases, we're not measuring it because we don't want to even know this. We kind of let's not do the studies. We don't want to know. Which you think about, is a really bad situation to be in. We're doing a crap job, but we don't want to be told we're doing a crap job, and we don't want to let other people know we're doing a crap job. So we've got to sort this out. I think it does come back to the value equation. Sometimes I use these kind of scales. I think you had one as well, didn't you, Muriel? So I call this the value scale. So basically, value is about getting maximum quality for minimum cost. But think of the quality in terms of not just the number of widgets, if you're in a factory, the amount of stuff, but it can also be the quality. So it can be things like well-being and performance and satisfaction, and some of the things George just mentioned as well, that kind of adaptability, flexibility, innovation. All those things are a kind of quality thing that we want more of. But what we want to do is reduce the costs. We want to reduce the amount of money we spend, we want to reduce the effort, the time, the resources. And we want to get that balance right. But what I find happens quite a lot in our industry is they say, oh, it's really difficult to measure quality, particularly productivity, well-being, but we can measure cost. So what we'll do is, to get better value, we'll just drive costs down, we'll drive space down. And Faye mentioned it as well, this idea that we see buildings as a cost burden rather than an investment. And it's because of the metrics that most people use when they're evaluating buildings. But we need to measure all this stuff over here as well, all the quality stuff. So as I said, I've been on this journey since '98. I've done over 100 post-occupancy evaluations. I wrote a book or guide for the British Council for Offices in 2007. I went back to them and said, look, it's been 16, 15 years since I wrote that guide. Are you going to pay me to write another one? And they said, no. I was like, well, can I have the copyright and I'll make my own book, and that's what I did. So I've just published literally last week or the week before my latest book, how to carry out post-occupancy evaluations came out. And the book actually goes through the 6 W's, the kind of why we should do it, when we should do it, how we should do it, there's a W at the end, who we do it to, where do we do it, and so on. But today I think I'm just going to focus on the why and the what's in it, just to give you a taster. So for me, the grandfather of post-occupancy evaluation was old Preiser, Wolfgang Preiser. Real sweet gent, he's not with us anymore. But he came up with this first definition, and he's saying post-occupancy evaluation, it's about evaluating in a systematic way, doing some having some data, having a little bit of rigor, rather than asking the MD or the CO or even the CFI whether they thought the building delivered. Why don't we actually have a little bit more data, gather some data, and understand it better? And that definition is on Wikipedia. I put it on Wikipedia. It's one of the only things I've managed to put on Wikipedia that no one's rejected. So I'm really pleased with that. If anyone's tried to put stuff on Wikipedia, there's Wikipedia fascists out there, and they will take it down within an instant. It's really difficult. But this one stood the test of time. So it's got to be systematic. It's got to be done over time. And then it's also, you can see from the text there, it's what are we measuring? Well, we want to measure the impact of our buildings on our people, on the organisation, on their productivity. And whilst, and Wolfgang says that as well, he says, it's really, we really need to look at how the building supports the organisation. And that's fundamental to most post-occupancy evaluation. It's less about the architecture, more about how the building supports the business and the individuals. But just to go back to that, I do appreciate that with buildings, you want them to have a bit of wow factor. We want them to be iconic. We want them to be beautiful. Quite often, they need to be an investment, provide a high return on investment for all the people who are putting up the buildings. And I get all that, but as I say, to me, ultimately, building's about supporting organisations and the individuals. And there's a little story there. You recognise the building, of course. What's it called? So it's currently called 30 St Mary's Axe. When it was originally designed, it was the Swiss Re building, because it was built for Swiss Re, the insurance agency. And Sarah Fox, who at the time was the head of workplace for Swiss Re, she said to Norman Foster, Foster's did it, I want a building where people get out of Heathrow and they say, take me to the Swiss Re building. And everyone knows it, it's iconic. Of course, it's called the Gherkin. So everyone gets out of Heathrow and they say, take me to the Gherkin, which is not what Swiss Re had in mind. And another little story about, I've actually done some analysis of the building. It's circular with a spiralling atria. The floor plate efficiency is absolutely rubbish. And after they built it, and they built too much, and they had sublet floors, and it took them years to fill those floors. So yes, it looks wonderful, it's iconic, but it's not exactly meeting the brief or the requirements of the client. So I've told you what POE is, a few definitions. Well, what isn't it? Well, my colleague many years ago, she talked to some facilities managers and said, what do you think POE is? And they weren't sure. And first of all, it's not about a building that's unoccupied or hasn't been used. A key criteria to POE is the building's there, people have moved in, it's been occupied over time, and then we do the analysis. We don't do the analysis after people have left the building, which is what some of them thought it was, post-occupancy, after the building's been occupied. I get the confusion. It's not about that. It's not a study of why buildings are dying or being sick. Some of them thought it related to post-mortem. But it's not. It's about the idea that the building's been occupied for some time. A pre-occupancy evaluation, if there ever is such a thing, might be when your client comes and says, we're thinking of moving, we don't know where to go. And what you do is you evaluate maybe 5 or 6 buildings, and all you can do at that stage is look at where the location is, the size of the building. You can maybe look at whether it's a lease or are they going to own the building. You can look at whether it can be sublet or not. You can do things before the client moves in, but POE after they've moved in. And the other thing is, and this is a big mistake most people make who have even heard of POE, they think it's post-project, whether that's a move to a new building or whether it's a refurbishment, but it's not. POE is ongoing, it can be ongoing. If you think about it, if you do an evaluation of the building you're in right now, and I recommend you do, that's a post-occupancy evaluation. You're evaluating the building you're in now. And there's a good reason for doing that. It's because, and I think, again, someone mentioned it earlier, buildings get out of date, organizations change, layouts, designs get out of date pretty quickly. So why wouldn't you do an annual evaluation of your building, for example? And why wouldn't you do an evaluation of your current building to find out what doesn't work and what you need to fix, particularly if you're going to go to another project or have a new building? So it's not just post-project, it's ongoing. There's a whole cycle of POE. Okay, so I've kind of hinted at why we do it. So this is the first one. All of us today, we've got to show that we're delivering value. We've got to show that we're delivering successful projects. So POE will allow you to do that. We can get people around the table. We can start to discuss what the success factors are. We can collate them. As you can see from this, they're not always the same. The project team, whether you're QS, engineer, architect, will all have a different view of what a successful building looks like. And quite often it is different to what the client asks. So we need to work that out. The other thing is it does give us design feedback. Obviously, that's the main purpose of it. We've got a new project, refurbishment, we've moved in, we get some feedback on whether the design works. And if you don't, then you're in the situation where you're not learning from mistakes, you're constantly building on those mistakes maybe. But basically, every time you build a building, it's a prototype, it's unique. And I don't want to stifle creativity and innovation and design, but we do need to learn from mistakes, and we do know that lots of mistakes happen, and quite often buildings don't live up to our expectations. So we need to constantly use feedback and feed forward. The other thing we can do with POE, as I just mentioned, if we do a survey of our current building, we can learn from what we're getting right and what we're not doing right. We can also start to use it to get feedback on what is required in the future, and we've heard lots of examples of that today as well. And again, I forget which one of our speakers was saying, but I think it was Kay, you can't just ask the occupants, what do you want? Because if you ask them what do you want, they want everything. And quite often we can't afford to give them everything. So you've got to tailor it a little bit. But you can start to evaluate what the important things are, the most important things are, the least important things are. And you can use that information with the design team to actually come up with something that is efficient, effective, and so on, and works, something a little bit more practical. I like this one. Well, I like the image. And the other reason you can use POE and why you might want to do it ongoing is because, maybe it's a UK thing, we don't like to complain in the UK. We do like to complain, but we don't make it public. So if you go to a restaurant, someone gives you a really awful meal, at the end of the meal they say, how was the meal? You go, oh yeah, it was lovely. And then you go out, you whinge to your wife how bad it was, and then you give them a really bad review on TripAdvisor and all the rest of it. So what we want to do is regular evaluations so that those minor problems, those little niggles that people have, we can nip them in the bud, and therefore they don't become chronic problems. And the other one, and the change managers down here are like this, a survey, if you're gathering feedback through a survey, I'll touch on techniques in a minute, but if you use a survey, it's a really good way of starting a change program, because everyone can fill it in. With electronic surveys, we don't need to sample anymore. We can invite everyone to take part in a survey, get their feedback on their current building, maybe start asking them about requirements for the next building and so on. So it's a really nice start to the change program once you've done your town hall and you've announced that there is a project and so on. And then the other one, bit strange. The other one, this is kind of more of a focus in, I would say, the last 5 years or so, particularly with sustainability issues and so on. POE now tends to be used to look at whether the building is acting or behaving the way it was designed and modeled to behave, particularly when it comes to energy use and so on. And sometimes that's referred to as building performance evaluation because it happens through the whole life cycle of the building. So you might just see that phrase, use BPE rather than POE. there's nuances between the two. But yeah, more and more so now, it is being used to understand how a building is working compared to how it was supposed to work, particularly for energy. We can't just keep designing, modeling buildings, saying how wonderfully sustainable they're going to be, and then finding actually, once you put people in there and they start messing around with things, it doesn't behave the way we want it to behave. The other reason we'll do POE is because the government in the UK tells us we must. If you're involved in government projects in the UK, you are now required to do post-occupancy evaluation as part of the project. There's now an ISO standard as well, so if you want to get into best practice, you might adopt the ISO standard and actually start carrying out post-occupancy evaluations. If you're an architect, particularly in the UK, the plan of work, so again, someone mentioned the different stages. We go kind of strategy briefing, concept design, detailed design, and so on. Right at the end there, we've got items 6 and 7, handover and closeout, and in use. And in both of those, there are elements of post-occupancy evaluation. So again, if you're an architect practicing in the UK, you are expected to conduct POEs. And over here, are you guys doing BREEAM and WELL and LEED and all of those kind of good stuff? So again, certainly if you look at BREEAM, in the aftercare section, you're expected to do a post-occupancy evaluation, again, to prove you delivered what you said you were going to deliver. And if you go into WELL and you look up the MIND concept, there's a requirement for post-occupancy evaluation there to get your WELL points. So those are all the reasons, good reasons, I hope you agree, why we need to do POE. The question is, why aren't we doing POE? The uptake is not as good as you might expect. I forget, it's in the book, but I forget the data, but it's only like 1 in 100 architects that are actually conducting POEs. Bearing in mind some of the results we've seen, I don't think that's good. But what puts people off, first of all, is the cost. How much is this thing going to cost us? Well, first of all, you need to budget for it. You know, I mentioned earlier, I like to see a POE budgeted in the project cost, but it doesn't have to be mega expensive. You could do some basic elements of POE. We can do feedback surveys at minimum, and an online feedback survey does not cost the world anymore. It's a very minute percentage of the project cost, but then you can do other things as well. Sponsoring, that's probably more important. You need someone in the organisation who's going to say, actually, we do need to do post-occupancy evaluation. We need to get that through. And they're going to make sure that the organisation does the POE and doesn't get cold feet or runs out of money or whatever. So really important to get your sponsors on board. Reputation is another issue, or can be an issue, particularly for architects. So architects used to think, well, if we do a POE, we might be liable for any defects in the building and so on. But back to my definition of POE, after the building has been occupied for some time. So you've normally gone through the commissioning phase, you've normally gone through the building defects phase, all of that. You're kind of 9 months to a year after project completion. That's when we're doing POE. Normally the issues that you find are as much behavioural as they are architectural. So, and actually, when I work for an architect's practice, it comes back to cost as well. When I worked for an architect's practice, I actually convinced our board that we should conduct post-occupancy evaluations for free to our clients, post-project at least. And if you're doing post-project, you might as well do it at the pre-project briefing stage. But 9 times out of 10, when we went into our clients and offered them a post-occupancy evaluation, they're like, well, first of all, thanks for coming back. We haven't seen you for a year. Nice to meet you again. They then say, it's really good that you're thinking about the impacts and you're not just letting these things lie. And nearly always they said, while you're here, we've got another project coming up. Do you want to bid for that work? So it's always worthwhile going back to clients. Expectations, opening a can of worms. I don't know if that's a phrase that translates over here, but this is one that the facilities managers are particularly worried about. Well, if we do an evaluation and we find things, then I've got to find the money to fix those things. Why would you want to do an evaluation and just open up that whole can of worms, and then we've got to explain why certain things weren't delivered and so on? Well, the reality is, if there is genuinely problems in the workplace, you need to fix them. You can't just ignore them. And I also worked for a facilities management company for 3 years. It was interesting times. And I said at one of our, in those days, there were 200 key account managers, so looking after 200 plus top clients. And one guy in the audience, he put his hand up and he said, I really don't think we should be doing POE. We don't want to get into that, liability, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately for me, the chief exec stood up next to me and said, if that's the way you think, you shouldn't be working for this organization. And I thought, good on you, mate. So we need to control, manage expectations, but we shouldn't ignore evaluation feedback. And a lot of it's just mindset. People just can't get their heads around why we should be doing these evaluations. So what's in it? Well, I was schooled on DGW consultancy. I worked there for a while, and we always talked about the 3 E's. So efficiency is about cost efficiency, space efficiency. We want to measure that. We want to know that our buildings are efficient and cost efficient. But we also need to know that our buildings are effective, that they support the organisation and the individuals. And also, we're quite interested in how well the buildings express the culture, the brand, and the identity of the organisation. It was good to see some conversation about that today as well. And then a fourth one, which is kind of coming a little bit more recent, is environmental factors. Really important that we measure the impact on carbon and so on. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but the different organisations are proposing different methodologies. You can have detailed POEs, you can have light touch POEs, diagnostic POEs. Within those levels, there's different methodologies that you can use. So I've already mentioned feedback, occupant feedback. Space analysis is a key one. You can get into some detail like doing sustainability audits and cognitive measurement and so on. But honestly, feedback's a good starting point, and maybe an expert walkthrough. So expert walkthrough, basically get your project team to walk through the building, either on practical completion or certainly a few months later, get them to look out for details that they can perceive that maybe the occupants can't perceive. So, for example, there was one building we did, it was practical completion day. We were walking around the building, and my designer colleague, the head of design, he was really upset by the fact that the desk partitions, the screens between the desks, was 2 centimetres lower than the filing cabinet on the end. And this was a detail that was really keeping him awake at night, really upset about it. And I pointed out to him that there were no chairs, and they were moving in the next day. So, you kind of look for different things as an expert. So don't just ask the occupants, we need an expert view as well. To get occupant feedback, I thoroughly recommend online surveys. It's just easy, it's cheap, gets everyone involved. But also consider other methodologies, interviews and workshops. So online surveys give you a level of detail. They give you some quantitative information. It gives you lots of numbers. 20% or say 80% of people satisfied with the temperature, but only 50% of people are satisfied with the acoustics. So we get the number, but then we need to interrogate the why. And I think that's where interviews and workshops come in. They give you the breadth, the depth of data rather than just the breadth that you get with surveys. And weirdly, what I've also found, and I don't know why, consider the stakeholders, consider who you want to get feedback from. And I suggest it's from everyone at all different levels. But what I found is that senior management, they don't like filling in a 15-minute survey, but they're quite happy for you to speak to them about the problems for an hour. I've never worked out why that is, but if you want to get to senior managers, interviews, and you can use all sorts of support groups and service groups and do workshops and so on. Space analysis will never go away. This is one of Krugeli's projects and a space analysis in there. Start with a space analysis on the current building, and then once you've moved, or during the design process actually, carry out further space analysis. It's useful to have a benchmark. It's useful to know what kind of densities you're operating at. It's useful to know what densities you're aiming for, what percentage of support space you need. There's a lot of benchmarks out there you can use, or at least benchmark within the organisation or set your own. And it's not just about the two-dimensional aspects of the space, the layout, it's also about the three-dimensional aspects. Again, Muriel showed you some examples of time utilization studies. Yeah, recommend those as well. There really is no point putting a building up that's empty for less than half of the time. I just, from a sustainability point of view, it just really upsets me that I'm going into so many offices and they're half empty and we're heating and lighting and maintaining and servicing these buildings. We've got to get people back into the building and we've got to design for that. So measure the utilization. And it's a great measure because people are voting with their feet. If they like the office, they'll come in. If they don't like the office, or their home, they feel their home's better, they won't come in. It's a really good metric of the success of a building. Right, environmental conditions. We've got our digital canary in the corner, haven't we? And it's measuring temperature and humidity. It's important to do this, don't get me wrong. We need to measure these things. But I would always start with feedback first. I would always go to the occupants. Is there a problem with temperature, lighting, noise, and so on, and then maybe do a full detailed study, doing some good environmental monitoring. But there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have one of the digital canaries in the corner. The issue I have, though, is it's really complicated. So, for example, even temperature, and I'm guessing that is measuring operative temperature, but the results will be confounded by mean radiant temperature, sunlight coming in and heating it up, and the air temperature in the room. So even when you talk about temperature, it's kind of quite complicated. There's different measures of temperature. And thermal comfort, you've got to consider humidity, airflow rates, all sorts of things. And many years ago, I went to an organization, and it's like a secret squirrel government organization, and they had archives like Men in Black, you know, the big warehouse and the racks of data when it was analog data rather than digital data. And in the middle of this vast underground space was a group of archivists sitting down there with their coats on and scarves and hats in the middle of this space, in summer even, I don't know, I can't remember And the facilities manager was tearing his hair out because he's like, I don't understand it. I've been down with my thermometer and it's 20 degrees. But they're all sitting in their jackets and coats. You know, these people are idiots. And I was like, no, I don't think that's not how they work. They're not going to just do this on purpose. I measured the wall temperatures. The wall temperatures were at 12 degrees, which means the temperature they were exposed to on average was about 16 degrees. That's why they were cold. So temperature's even difficult. And then all the other things, you know, these are psychophysical variables. Thermal comfort is not the same as temperature. Noise is unwanted sound. So you can measure sound levels, but it won't give you a good metric of noise. And I mentioned thermal comfort. And even space. Our perception of space is not just dependent on the size of the room. It's dependent on lots of other factors, socio-physical, socio-demographic factors, psychological factors. Measure sustainability as well. I say more and more important, not just whether we're delivering what we're predicted, but again, there's benchmarks out there. You can measure waste, you can measure energy, you can measure paper, you can measure water consumption. These are all good things to measure to know that you're delivering a full-rounded, successful building. And back to where I started. I started talking about value, because I don't want us to just think it's just always about cost. It's always about reducing the cost and reducing the space. It's about value. It's about getting that maximum quality, whether it's comfort or performance or productivity, for minimal cost. So it's actually a good thing to kind of plot them. You can plot the cost, fit-out cost. It's an old slide now. But you can plot the fit-out cost against the satisfaction levels or comfort levels or whatever. And it gives you a much better idea of what buildings are performing or not. I mean, if this was a portfolio of my 12 offices, I'd be looking at the red dot in particular, but why is that building not performing so well when I've spent so much money on it? Whereas there's 2 green dots, and oh, they're doing well. What's making them more successful? And the book itself does show you how to develop your own post-occupancy evaluations and feedback surveys and all the different elements. But there are surveys, standard surveys out there. I mentioned the Leesman Index already. And they're great if you want to benchmark, because if you're benchmarking your company with 1 million other respondents, that might be a useful exercise. But what I found with that is you don't get the flexibility. You can't tailor the survey to maybe look for the things that are more important to you for your success factors. So just bear that in mind. My actual advice is look at someone else's survey, crib it, I was going to say steal it, look at how they're doing it, learn from there's loads of surveys online, learn how they're doing it, and then include that, develop your own, and it'll give you much better results. So that's it. We need lots of data. If you're going to do one thing, collect feedback. At the end of the day, the customer is king, the customer is always right, not always, but they're a good starting point. Maybe marry that up with a few expert views. Work out what you want, what are the important metrics to you, and then focus on those metrics. Don't just blitz everything. And please do a POE, even if it's post-project, but I recommend you do a pre-project one too. And maybe do them every year if you can. That's it, so there you go.